freezing to death, blue-lipped and one night from it. That was the moment Josephine's frozen chimney would change everything. Though she and her son Eli didn't yet know a widower 5 miles off was about to notice the dead smoke and come through the blizzard to save them. 3 sticks of wood left in the box, a stove gone cold and ticking as it cooled, snow sifting soft and steady through a split shingle overhead, dusting the quilt at the foot of the bed where mother and boy lay, wrapped together in every blanket the house still owned. While out in the front room, the last kitchen chair Josephine had left to burn was giving up its final orange coals to the dark. Across the white 2 miles off, a man named Amos Tanner stood at his own window with his coffee going cold in his hand, doing the same small ritual he'd done every winter morning for 2 years since his wife died, running his eye down the line of homestead roofs visible from his rise, counting the threads of smoke rising off each one, the way a man counts sheep in a pen to be sure none got out overnight. Every chimney along that line was smoking steady against the gray sky. Every one but the Dyer place, small and low against the base of the ridge, standing dead silent under the snow with nothing coming off its stovepipe at all. And Amos Tanner, who had learned 2 winters back exactly what a cold chimney in a blizzard could mean, felt something drop cold and sure in his stomach, set his coffee down without finishing it, and went for his horse. This is the high, hard country above the town of Coldwater in the winter of 1887, and this is the story of a proud young widow who had let the whole county believe she was managing just fine, right up until the night she came within an hour of not managing at all, and of the one neighbor who bothered to look closely enough to notice the difference. Stay with this one. The porch scene near the end, the one with the whole congregation gone quiet, is worth the wait. But first, let's go back to the beginning, to a woman alone on a failing hill farm who had decided months before that storm ever came that asking for help was a thing she simply wasn't going to do. If you're enjoying stories like Josephine's, consider becoming a channel member. Just tap join beside the channel name. It costs you a minute, and it helps keep these stories coming. Josephine Dyer was 26 years old, and for the better part of a year, she had been doing something almost nobody in Coldwater knew she was doing, which was slowly losing a fight against a piece of land that had never once, in 6 years of trying, given her family more than it took back. She was, without any effort spent toward it, a quietly beautiful woman, dark hair that had come loose from its pins by mid-morning most days, a wide mouth that still remembered how to smile even when there wasn't much reason to, eyes a deep, steady brown that gave away almost nothing she didn't choose to give away, and a straight-backed, unhurried way of carrying herself that made people in town assume, wrongly, that everything up at the Dyer place was in order. She had a low voice that didn't rise even when she was frightened, and a habit of setting her chin a particular way when she meant a thing to be the end of a conversation. Her husband Robert had died a year and 2 months back, thrown from a green horse on a hillside not a quarter mile from the cabin, and had left her a hard scrabble quarter section up in the cold hills above Coldwater that had never been more than a hope even when there'd been 2 of them working it. She had a boy, Eli, 6 years old, quick and quiet and watchful the way children get when they've learned to read a room before they've learned much else. With his father's sandy hair and his mother's steady eyes and the particular gravity of a child who understood, without ever being told outright, that his mother was carrying something heavy and that his job, small as he was not to add to the weight of it. Josephine had been too proud through the whole long autumn before that blizzard to let a single soul in Coldwater know how thin things had truly gotten. She sold what stock she could spare at the harvest fair and split her own wood and mended her own roof as best a woman alone could mend a roof. And every time a neighbor asked, in that careful way people ask when they already suspect the answer, how she was managing up there on her own, Josephine had smiled her steady smile and said she was managing just fine. Thank you kindly. It was, in its way, the last thing she had left that was entirely hers to keep. The choosing of what the county did and didn't know about her, and she had guarded it fiercely. the way a person guards the one door still locked against the world when every other door has already blown open. Asking for help to Josephine had never once felt like relief. It had felt every time she'd come close to doing it like surrender, like handing over the last proof she had that she could still do this alone. So she hadn't asked. And by the time the first hard blizzard of that winter came down off the mountains 3 days early and shut the whole county under 4 feet of snow, nobody in Coldwater had the faintest idea that the widow Dyer was down to 3 sticks of firewood, a half sack of cornmeal, and a roof that let more weather in than it kept out. The storm came in on a Tuesday with a wind that Josephine had never in her life heard the like of. A low, steady howl that didn't let up for 2 full days, piling snow against the north wall of the cabin until it stood taller than the window, and turning the short walk to the woodpile into a fight a person could lose. She had burned careful through the first night, feeding the stove sparingly, telling herself the storm would break by morning the way most did. It hadn't broken by morning. By the second morning, her woodpile, never large to begin with because she hadn't the strength at fall to split more than she strictly needed, had gone from small to nearly nothing. And by the second afternoon, nearly nothing had become 3 split sticks laid crosswise in the box, and a growing cold understanding of exactly what that meant. She burned the last of the good wood slow through that second evening, feeding it a stick at a time, and when it was gone, she looked around the one-room cabin for anything else that would take a flame and keep her boy from the particular cold that kills quietly in the night, without ever announcing itself as anything worse than sleepiness. There was a kitchen chair, plain pine, one of a set her husband had built the first spring they were married. She broke it over her knee with a strength she didn't know grief had left in her, and fed it to the stove a slat at a time, and it bought them the second night and most of the morning after. By the second night, mother and boy were down in the one bed together with every blanket the house owned piled over them, Eli tucked in tight against her chest the way she'd held him as an infant, and Josephine lay in the dark doing the particular arithmetic that every frontier widow does sooner or later, whether she wants to or not, counting how many hours of warmth was left in the last of the chair, how many hours of cold the two of them could survive past that, and which of the two sums was going to run out first. She did not let herself cry doing that arithmetic. She held Eli close instead and told him, in a voice she worked hard to keep steady, that the storm would break soon and that they only had to be patient a while longer. And the boy, who was 6 and frightened and trying very hard to be brave for his mother's sake the way she was trying to be brave for his, nodded against her shoulder and didn't ask the question Josephine could feel him not asking, which was how much longer soon actually meant. Snow had begun coming in through a split shingle above the bed sometime in the night, a fine steady dust of it settling on the quilt, and Josephine had watched it a long while in the near dark, too tired by then to move to catch it, thinking in a distant, floating sort of way that a roof letting snow in onto a bed was a thing that ought to frighten her more than it did, and that the fact it wasn't frightening her the way it should have was itself the most frightening part of the whole long night. She had let the neighbors believe she was managing because it had felt all that hard year like the last proof she owned, that Robert's death hadn't broken her, that she could hold the place together on her own 2 hands the way he'd have wanted, without becoming the kind of widow the county whispered about over coffee. Poor thing, and over her head, ought to sell up and go back to her people. She had people, distant cousins, 2 counties over, who would have taken her and Eli in without a second thought. She hadn't written them. Writing them would have meant admitting in her own hand that the arithmetic had already beaten her, and Josephine Dyer was not yet, in her own accounting of herself, a woman willing to admit that, which is exactly why nobody in Coldwater, not the widow Alden 2 farms over, not the Pruitts down toward town, not a single soul among the good, decent, church-going people who filled the pews on Sunday and would have driven straight up that hill with a wagon load of firewood the instant they'd known, had the first idea that the widow on the failing quarter section above the ridge was, on the 3rd morning of that blizzard, an hour or less from freezing to death alongside her only child. Nobody but Amos Tanner, who ranched the Good Bottomland 2 miles off, and who had gotten into a habit, since his own wife Ellen died 2 winters back, of standing at his window each cold morning and running his eye down the line of neighboring roofs, counting smoke the way another man might count his cattle, because it was the one small, useful thing his grief had ever taught him to do with an early morning that would otherwise have simply sat empty in his chest. Amos was 32, big through the shoulders in the unhurried way of a man who'd worked hard land his whole life and never once needed to make a show of the strength it had built in him, quiet by nature and quieter still since Ellen's fever took her, with a slow, careful way of speaking that made people in Coldwater trust him without quite being able to say why. He had 2 children, Gideon, 9, gone hard and silent since his mother's death, the way boys that age sometimes go, and Nell, 6, who still cried some nights and didn't fully understand yet that crying wasn't going to bring her mother back through the door. Amos fed them, clothed them, kept the ranch running and the roof sound and the woodpile full, and did every one of those things with the flat, careful competence of a man determined that his children would never once have cause to say their father hadn't managed. What he had not managed in 2 years was to walk past the closed door of Ellen's sewing room without his chest going tight, or to do much of anything with the trunk of her dresses folded away in the loft, except leave it exactly where it sat, because he could neither bear to look at what was in it nor bear to give it away. On that 3rd gray morning of the storm, Amos stood at his window with his coffee going cold in his hand and ran his eye down the familiar line of roofs the way he did every morning. And every chimney along the ridge was throwing up its thin gray thread of smoke against the sky, steady and ordinary, except the Dyer place, small and low at the base of the rise, sitting under its blanket of snow with nothing coming off the stovepipe at all. Nothing the morning before either. Now that he thought hard on it, he'd noticed and half dismissed it, told himself the wind was flattening the smoke, that a woman managing a place alone through a hard storm might simply be banking her fire, careful to stretch it. But 2 mornings of no smoke, in weather that had not let up once in 3 full days, was not a woman being careful with her fire. Amos knew exactly what a cold chimney in a blizzard usually meant, because he had buried a wife who'd taken a fever that started as nothing more than a bad chill. And a man who has watched cold take somebody does not get to unlearn ever again how fast it can happen and how quiet it is while it's happening. He set his coffee down without finishing it, told Gideon to mind his sister and bank the fire high, and went for his big gray horse. It was near a 2-mile fight through drifts that stood chest high on the animal in places. An hour of driving the horse forward a few hard yards at a time and letting it blow before driving it forward again. The wind coming sideways off the ridge hard enough to take a man's breath if he faced it wrong, and Amos Tanner made every yard of it without once letting himself slow down to consider what he might find at the end of it. Because considering that too closely was a thing a man couldn't afford to do while he still had 2 more miles of snow between himself and finding out. He reached the Dyer cabin a little past 9 that morning, half buried on its windward side, smokeless and silent as a held breath, and pounded on the door and got no answer of any kind, not even the sound of somebody stirring toward it, and put his shoulder into the frozen door until the latch gave and the wood splintered and he was inside, into a cold that struck him as somehow colder than the storm he just fought through 2 miles of. Because outside a man expects the cold and braces for it, and a cabin is supposed to be the one place a person gets to stop bracing. He found them in the one bed, buried under every blanket the house owned, and for one long, terrible half-second, in the gray light through the doorway, he could not tell if he'd arrived in time or not. Josephine's lips had gone the color of old bruises, and her breathing, when he got close enough to find it, was slow and shallow and far too even. The particular stillness of a body that has stopped fighting the cold and started simply drifting along with it. Eli was worse, or looked it, small and gray-lipped and barely stirring, when Amos got a hand under the boy's chin. And it was that sight, a 6-year-old child gone, that that quiet that put the fear all the way through Amos Tanner and had him moving fast and rough with the urgency of a man who understood, in his body before his mind caught up to it, that he had arrived at the very edge of being too late rather than safely ahead of it. He wrapped them both in every blanket he could gather in the space of a minute, got Josephine up onto the horse in front of him, with Eli bundled against her chest between them, and made the 2 miles back to his own place in less time than it had taken him to fight the 2 miles out. Driving the horse harder than he'd ever driven an animal in his life, half of him watching the trail and half of him watching the two still quiet shapes wrapped against him, willing them both, in the wordless way a person prays without exactly praying, to still be there when he got them home. It was, the doctor told him later that day, a near thing. Another few hours, Doc Sutter said, plain and grave. Maybe not even that many, and there would have been nothing left in that cabin for anybody to ride out and find but a mother and a boy who'd simply gone to sleep and not woken again. Almost heard that sentence standing in his own kitchen, with his hat still in his hands and his children hovering wide-eyed in the doorway, and something in his chest went very still and very cold at exactly how close the margin had been. Closer than he let himself say out loud to anyone. Closer than he fully let himself feel until much later, alone, once the house had quieted for the night. When Josephine came back to herself, hours later, it was slow, the way waking from a deep cold comes slow, a gradual, aching return of feeling to fingers and feet that had gone past hurting into a numbness that had frightened her more than pain ever could. She woke in a strange bed, in a warm room, with the particular good smell of a well-fed fire, and beside her, Eli sleeping sound with real color back in his small face, and it took her a long, disoriented minute to understand where she was and whose house she'd woken in, and exactly how she and her son had come to be under a stranger's quilt instead of their own leaking roof. She understood it fully a moment later, all at once, the way a person understands a thing they've been circling without quite looking at directly, that she had come within an hour, maybe less, of freezing herself and her only child to death out of pure, stubborn pride, and that a neighbor she barely knew had ridden through a blizzard on the strength of nothing but a missing thread of smoke to pull them both back from it. And Josephine Dyer, who had not cried once through the whole hard year since Robert died, not at the funeral, not through the long autumn of pretending she was managing, wept then in a stranger's warm bed with her living son breathing steady beside her, from shame and relief so tangled together she couldn't have said, if pressed, which one was doing the crying. Almas, standing in the doorway with a fresh armload of wood, saw the tears and did the kind thing, which was to pretend for a moment that he hadn't, setting the wood down careful and quiet and busying himself at the stove until Josephine had gathered herself enough that neither of them would have to name what he'd walked in on. She tried, the very first day her legs would hold her, to take herself and Eli back up to the ruin of her own cabin, out of a stubborn, bone-deep shame that sat in her worse than the cold had, and got exactly as far as Amos's front door before he stopped her, mild and unhurried, leaning one shoulder against the frame the way a man leans when he intends to be there a while. Cabin's still got no wood in the box and half a roof over it in 4 feet of snow between here and there, he said. You're welcome to go on up and freeze on principle if your pride's set on it, but you'd be leaving your boy behind by my fire while you did, because I've buried one person this winter who didn't get carried out in time, and I won't stand by and let it happen to a child on account of his mother's feelings. It was said without any heat in it at all, plain as a man remarking on the weather, and it was, for exactly that reason, entirely unanswerable. Josephine stood in the doorway with her hands still on the latch and felt the whole of her pride come up hard against the whole of his plain sense, and lost, and sat back down by his fire, beaten fair and square by a kindness she had no ready argument against. She was not used to being cared for, and it sat on her strangely, the way a coat cut for somebody else sits on a body it wasn't measured for. It took her the better part of a month before she stopped flinching a little every time Amos set a plate in front of her without being asked, or split extra wood without being asked, or simply noticed the way he seemed to notice most things without remark, that she was cold or tired or worn thin, and did something about it before she'd said a single word. She kept waiting, that whole first month, for some bill to come due for it, some price she'd eventually be asked to pay for all that plain, steady kindness. And it took her a good while longer than the month to understand that Amos Tanner simply wasn't the kind of man who kept that sort of ledger. The talk started in Coldwater before Josephine was even well enough to sit up on her own, because the hills above Coldwater were a small world, and a young widow and her boy taken in under a widower's roof, his wife Ellen not 2 years in the ground, and the whole shut-in winter still ahead of them was exactly the sort of thing a small world exists to chew on at length. Mrs. Pruitt was first up the road the moment the trail broke enough to allow a wagon through, full of careful, concerned questions about appearances, how it looked, a young woman living there, the two of them alone under one roof with the children all snowed in together. The talk it was already stirring down in town. Surely, Mrs. Pruitt suggested, Josephine could be moved somewhere more seemly the instant she was fit to travel, somebody's spare room, anywhere that wasn't a widower's house. Amos heard her out on his own porch, patient and level, and then said the thing that ended up settling the matter for good, whether Coldwater liked the settling or not. Mrs. Pruitt, 3 days back I pulled that woman and her boy out of a frozen bed an hour, maybe less, from dead. In a county full of good, decent neighbors, not one of whom had thought to go check on a proud widow's chimney in a blizzard. She's got no wood, no money, and no roof that won't kill her and that child before spring. So she's stopping here, by my fire, where it's warm, till the thaw, and not 1 day sooner. I don't care who talks. A man who'd let a widow and her boy freeze to keep his own good name clean hasn't got a name worth keeping in the first place, and I'd rather be talked about than be that man. You're welcome to carry that back to town, word for word, if it'll save you the trouble of guessing at it. Mrs. Pruitt went back down the road with her answer, and Coldwater talked, and Amos Tanner went on, not caring one particular bit, and Josephine stayed. She earned her keep that winter the only way her pride would allow her to take a roof and a fire she hadn't paid for, and it turned out to be the thing that saved the whole household, in ways none of them could have guessed that first hard week. Josephine Dyer was a quilter, and not an ordinary one, the rare, true kind who could take a basket of worn scraps and cast-off ends that most women would have thrown on the fire and piece them into something warm enough and beautiful enough to stop a person cold in a doorway. And Amos Tanner's house, in the 2 years since Ellen died, had been a cold place in every way that wasn't strictly about the stove. A grieving man and 2 motherless children living inside a home that had quietly stopped being one on the day they buried her. Josephine set up her frame by the fire in the front room and quilted through the long, snow-locked weeks that followed. And the warmth she made wasn't only the kind a body slept under. She pieced quilts for the children first, plain warm ones from her own scrap basket, and little Nell took to trailing her from chair to frame like a small, devoted shadow, learning to set tiny stitches at her elbow. And Gideon, hard, silent Gideon, who hadn't cried since his mother's funeral and had gone about the ranch ever since with his jaw set like a boy twice his age. Gideon, she drew out slowly, the way she'd learned to draw grief out of a person, not by asking after it directly, but by needing him, needing wood split fine for the frame, needing a boy tall enough to reach the high shelf, needing someone to admire the evenness of her stitches until the silent boy was talking again, gruff and pleased by candle time most evenings. It was deep in that same winter that Josephine did the thing that finally broke something open in Amos Tanner and remade him a little, in a way he hadn't expected and couldn't at first find words for. Looking through the loft for piecing scraps one afternoon, she found the trunk, Ellen's dresses, packed carefully away by a husband who could neither bear to look at them nor bear to give them off, folded down in the dark for 2 years, exactly as they'd been left. Josephine asked his leave to use the fabric, gently, and when he gave it, not quite understanding, at first, what she meant to do with it, she cut Ellen's dresses over the course of several careful weeks. The blue one the children remembered as their mother's Sunday best, the everyday green one she'd worn near daily, the good wool shawl she'd wrapped them both in 100 times, and pieced the cloth into 2 quilts, one for Gideon and one for Nell, so that the 2 motherless children could sleep every night for the rest of their childhood, warm under the very colors their mother had worn against them in life. When she put those quilts into their arms and the children understood, all at once, exactly what they were holding. Gideon, 9 years old, hard and quiet since the funeral, who had not cried once in 2 years that anyone in that house had witnessed, put his face down into the fabric and sobbed like the boy he still was underneath all that careful silence. Nell stopped crying in the nights after that, because now, she told Josephine plainly, her mother was over her while she slept. Amos went out to the coal barn that evening and stood there a long while by himself because the woman half of Cold Water was busy calling a scandal had just handed his grieving children back a piece of their mother that he himself, in 2 full years, had only ever known how to lock away in a trunk in the dark. "You made my children warm in a way I never knew how to," he told her later that night by the fire, once he trusted his voice enough to say it plain. "Ellen's been gone 2 years, and I kept her boxed up in that loft because I couldn't bear her gone, and I couldn't bear her near, either one. And you took what I couldn't touch and made it into something that'll keep my babies warm every winter of their lives." I don't rightly have the words for what that is, Josephine. She only told him, quiet, that scraps a person can't bear to look at are still warm underneath, if somebody who loved the owner is willing to do the cutting, and that Ellen had plainly been worth loving a great deal, to leave a house this full of the missing of her. And the 2 of them sat by that fire a long while after the children were asleep, grieving their own dead together in the particular, unhurried way 2 people can when neither one is trying to fix the other's grief, only sit alongside it, which is its own kind of courting and a good deal warmer than most. The winter wore on, long and white and shut in tight, and in the strange forced closeness of a snow-locked house, the 5 of them became, without a single one of them deciding it on purpose, something that had started to look a great deal like a family. Eli and Nell ran the house of an afternoon like a small noisy herd, and Gideon, talking again and looser in the shoulders than he'd been in 2 years, appointed himself their captain without being asked. Amos, coming in from the stock most evenings to a house that smelled of baking bread and rang with children's voices and was warm clear into the corners for the first time in 2 winters, took to standing a moment in his own doorway most nights as if he'd walked, by mistake, into a better house than the one he owned, and had to remind himself, less and less willingly as the season wore on, that the arrangement was only meant to last till the thaw. Josephine told him her own grief, in turn by that same fire over the low weeks that followed. Robert, a decent, hopeful man who had worked himself near to the bone on hills that were never going to carry the 2 of them the way he'd hoped, and the long, proud, terrible autumn after his death when asking for help had felt to her like handing over the last thing that was still hers to keep. Amos understood the pride in that better than most, having carried a fair share of his own. He took to sitting across the fire from her most evenings once the children were down, drinking coffee gone half cold, talking low about the stock, the weather, the dead. And there was a thing growing quietly in that warm, lamp-lit room between the 2 of them that neither one named out loud, partly out of grief's own good manners, and partly because naming it would have meant reckoning square with what came after the thaw. And what came after the thaw was the one subject the whole snow-locked house had silently agreed, by unspoken vote, not to raise. So they didn't raise it. They only sat by the same fire, week after week, and let the thing between them bank itself down slow and steady like coals, the way the truest fires do. If this story is worth your evening, the kindest way to say so is to become a channel member. Just tap join beside the channel name. By the time the roads finally broke open in the early spring, Josephine's quilts had become a quiet wonder through 3 counties. The doctor's wife saw the ones Josephine had made for Gideon and Nell and had to have one of her own. And then the whole county wanted them. And Josephine Dyer, the scandalous widow half of Coldwater, had spent a winter whispering about was, almost overnight, Josephine Dyer, whose quilts a body waited a season for and paid dear to own. She had money of her own again for the first time since Robert died, and a name in the county for something good and rare. And the talk should, by any fair accounting, have died right there. It did not die there, because Obadiah Crane would not let it. Crane was a deacon and a man of considerable standing in Coldwater, lean and cold and certain of himself in the particular way of a man who has long since confused the sound of his own disapproval with the voice of God speaking through him. He had decided, over the course of that long winter, that the Tanner household stood as a standing offense against the morals of the county, and that it fell to him personally to see it corrected. He was not moved in the slightest by the plain fact that the woman had nearly died, nor by the fact that she'd made a pair of grieving children warm again with her own 2 hands. Those were sentiment to Obadiah Crane, and Crane dealt strictly in rules. An unmarried woman had wintered the whole season under an unmarried man's roof, and that, to his mind, was fornication's near neighbor, whatever the actual facts of the matter happened to be, and he meant to see the thing ended in front of the whole congregation, publicly and for the record. Crane brought it before a full meeting of the church and the town's leading men on a cold, bright morning in early April, and moved formally that Josephine Dyer be named in her sin before the assembly and put out of the county entirely, and that Amos Tanner be censured before the congregation for harboring her. He made his case in a cold, rolling voice, certain of every word, about appearances in the setting of a poor example, and the slippery road such arrangements led decent communities down, and the protection owed to the county's good homes and better families. Amos stood the moment Crane finished. Josephine stood beside him a heartbeat later, which Crane had plainly not expected, and which put the first small crack of doubt into his certainty. Deacon Crane wants this woman put out of the county, Amos said, level and unhurried, in a voice that carried clean to the back pew without ever once rising. For the sin of not freezing to death politely, so let's have the whole of it plain, since he's left most of it out. 3 days into last December's blizzard, I found Josephine Dyer and her 6-year-old boy in a frozen bed with no wood, no fire, and no food, an hour or less from dead, in a county full of good church-going neighbors, not one of whom had thought to check a proud widow's chimney. I carried them to my fire because the plain alternative was 2 graves come the thaw. She's lived under my roof 5 months since, and in that time she's made my motherless children warm, in body and a good deal more besides, asked for nothing in return, and turned rag ends and cast off scraps into the finest quilting this county's ever seen. That's the whole of the sin Deacon Crane wants her run out of Coldwater for. He turned unhurried, to face the room. I'll tell you same as I told Mrs. Pruitt back in December, and same as I'll tell my maker whenever the day comes for it. A man who'd let a widow and a child freeze to keep his own name clean hasn't got a name worth keeping. I didn't care who talked then, and I don't now. If the price of doing the plain, decent thing is Deacon Crane's disapproval, I'll pay that price gladly and count it cheap. Josephine spoke next because she had learned, over the course of that hard winter, that she was a woman who could. I'd be dead, Deacon, she said, quiet and clear enough to carry to every pew. Me and my Eli both, buried somewhere up in those hills, and not one soul in this county would have known it before spring. Amos Tanner's the only person who looked. You stand there troubled over how it appeared, that he saved us. Let me tell you plainly how it appeared to me, lying in that warm bed alive, with my boy breathing the steady beside me. It appeared like the only real act of Christian kindness anybody in Coldwater managed that whole hard December. You can vote to put me out if this meeting sees fit, but you'll be putting out the very woman who'd have been a corpse if this county's careful worry over appearances had ever once been the thing that came looking for her. It wasn't. A man who plainly did not care one bit about appearances came looking instead. That is the whole of it, start to finish. The meeting did not vote her out. Having heard for the first time the plain shape of the actual thing rather than Crane's cold, tidy abstraction of it, the room turned hard the other way because there is little a town of decent people likes less once it sees a matter clearly than a righteous man who would sooner have had a frozen widow than an arrangement that made him uncomfortable. Obadiah Crane felt his own standing curdle in real time as the faces around him shifted from agreement to something closer to shame, and he left that meeting a good deal smaller than he'd walked into it and stayed smaller in Coldwater long after, because a town will forgive a great deal sooner than it will forgive being shown its own coldness, laid out plainly in the shape of a woman and a child who nearly froze in the middle of it, while everyone else's good name stayed spotless. Amos married Josephine that spring, once the thaw had fully come, and the road stood open in every direction, and she was, for the first time since December, entirely free to choose for herself and beholden to no one, which was exactly the condition he had been quietly, deliberately waiting for. "I told this whole county back in December I didn't care who talked," he said to her on the porch, with the last of the snow going soft and gray off the hills below them. "And I've spent a whole winter proving I meant it. I find I mean it more every week that's passed since. But I waited on purpose to say the rest of this till the roads opened up, and you could go wherever you pleased, back to your own place, into town, clear out of this county to somewhere nobody knows a thing about either one of us. So you'd know for certain I'm not asking you this, because we were snowed in together all winter, and it's the easy, convenient thing to do now. I'm asking because you walked into a cold, dead house last December and made it warm clear through, mine and my children's both. And I've found I can't go back to living in the cold, and I don't much want to learn how. Marry me, Josephine, not for the room by the fire. You've earned a fire of your own by now, and money of your own, and a good name in this county that's entirely your own doing. You don't need mine for any of that. Marry me because Gideon and Nell have taken to praying for it out loud at supper, and because somewhere under all those quilts you pieced this winter, I stopped being able to picture my own fire without you sitting by it." He almost smiled the way he rarely did. "And I still don't care one bit who talks. Only now I'd like the talk in Coldwater to be about a wedding instead." Josephine, who had lain down in a frozen cabin, certain that she and her boy were going to die quietly and unmissed on a hillside nobody checked, looked at the man who had ridden 2 miles through a blizzard because her chimney had gone quiet, when not another soul in the county had thought to look twice at it. "You came through a blizzard because you saw no smoke rising off my chimney," she said, "when nobody else in these hills looked at all. You gave me your fire and didn't care who talked over it, and then you let me cut your late wife's dresses to warm your living children, which is about the most trusting thing I've ever seen one grieving person do for another. I've been warm clear through since somewhere around that day, Amos, and I believe I've been afraid this whole while to call it by its right name." She took both his hands in hers. "Yes, I'll marry you. I'll quilt by your fire the rest of my days and warm your children and mine, and whatever this cold county throws at any of us, and I'll be glad of it every single morning. Married to a man who looked at a chimney with no smoke rising off it and didn't just look away and go on with his coffee. Yes, Amos, let them talk. Let the whole county come to the wedding and talk their fill." They were married that spring in the little church at Coldwater, with Mrs. Pruitt in the second pew loudly telling anyone who'd listen that she had always said the two of them were a fine match, and Obadiah Crane conspicuously absent, and Gideon standing straight back beside Amos, looking for once entirely like the boy he actually was, rather than the small, hard man grief had briefly made of him. And little Nell and Eli, thick as thieves by then, chasing each other around the churchyard afterward in their good clothes until somebody's mother called them both to order. Josephine's quilts grew famous past those 3 counties in the years that followed, and she trained Nell up at the frame as the girl grew tall enough to reach it properly, and she kept always at the foot of her own marriage bed the very first quilt she'd pieced in that house, not one of Ellen's, but a plain, warm thing made entirely of her own worn scraps. To remind herself, she told anyone who ever asked about it that the warmest things in this world are most often made out of what somebody else had already decided was worthless, a fact she had come to know, by then, from both ends of it. Gideon and Nell slept under their mother's colors every winter of their childhood after that, and grew up knowing, in the plainest possible way, that they had been loved by two mothers in their lives, one who had borne them and one who had simply refused to let them go on sleeping cold. And Amos Tanner lived out a long, warm life by a fire he never once regretted sharing, and told anyone in Coldwater who'd stand still long enough to hear it that the best thing he ever did in his whole life was ride toward a chimney with no smoke coming off it, instead of turning back toward his own warm kitchen and telling himself it was likely nothing. That is the whole of the story of Josephine Dyer, a proud young widow who lay down one blizzard night fully expecting to freeze with her son in her arms, and was carried out of that cold instead by a neighbor who noticed what everyone else in the county had simply failed to look for, and who told the whole talking town, plain to their faces, that he had room by his fire and did not much care who knew it, and who found by that same fire warmth enough to see her through the whole rest of her days,